Today we learn about the traditional hand missal, what it is, how to use it, and why it's an essential tool for anyone attending the Latin Mass. Whether you're new to tradition, returning to the church, or helping your children follow along, the Missal helps you enter more deeply into the mystery of the Holy Sacrifice. We explain the difference between the ordinary and propers of the Mass, suggest how to place ribbons, and how to find the current liturgical day. We also walk through the structure of a low Mass, discuss variations, and offer tips for beginners learning to pray with the Missal. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, and please consider leaving a rating and a review on the podcast. This will make sure that more people can find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. So today on the Catholic Mass series, let's join Mr. James Vogel, editor of Angelus Press, for episode 38, a guide through the 1962 Hand Missal. Welcome back to the Mass series, and joined this time by Mr. Jim Vogel, editor of Angelus Press. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Andrew. How are you?
I'm good, and you are wearing a tie and a jacket, making me look like a slob.
Well,
not hard, but thanks.
No comment.
Thanks for that. All right, so we are going to be talking about participation. We are starting this kind of little subsection about participation in the Mass. Last week we saw with Father Palco the importance of participation, why it's needed, why it's important. One of the ways that he said was an important way of participating in the Mass, along with saying the responses if it's culturally appropriate, along with singing, is following the prayers of the Mass. How do we do that? With a hand missal. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, right?
That's right. And it is a shameless self-plug because, of course, we publish a hand missal at Angelus Press, and we think ours is the best. I think objectively it's the best. And in fact, what's particularly handy for this video is we just got in our new large print daily missal. It's the same as the normal hand missal, except it's, as you might imagine, bigger. The font is bigger. The whole book is bigger. And I think you'll be able to see it on the screen better. So,
oh, nice.
I think especially for people who might struggle with their eyesight or even with dim lighting in a church, this book is great. It's handy. I'm tempted to use it myself. And for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be using the new large print Roman Catholic daily missal that we publish. So in a certain way, it is certainly the most popular. It's the most important thing we publish in a way because, as you just pointed out, I think it's the most comprehensive guide to encouraging and helping this participation in the Holy Sacrifice. We are going to be talking a little bit, I think later in the episode about, or not this episode, but in the series, the Catholic Mass series, why the 1962 Missal versus the 1955. Yes.
Just to be clear, the missal that Angelus Press publishes is the 1962 Missal. Right. Is that correct? Right, and that's simply because it's the missal, the altar missal that the society uses. We'll get into the reasons, as you mentioned, in a different podcast. But I think, especially for beginners, because a lot of this video is going to be for newcomers to the traditional Latin Mass, if that doesn't make sense to you and you're wondering, which missal does the priest use? If you're going to Mass at a society chapel or almost anywhere else, it's almost certainly these days going to be the 1962 Missal. So it's the most common. It's the one the society uses. And as the publisher of the society, it's what we use. So yes, for now, it is good to mention that. But stay tuned for a later episode if you're interested in the history and the whys. Sure. The Missal, we're using that term, the Missal. Yeah. Again, starting with some very basic principles here. And like you said, in some ways, this is very much a newcomer's guide to how to use the Missal, but hopefully informative for others as well. Missal, I used the term earlier on hand Missal. There's also altar Missal. What's the difference here? Right. So I think the original usage of the term Missal would in fact be the altar Missal, the book that you would see the priest using at the altar at Mass, has all the prayers for the priest at Mass. That missal is in Latin. It includes all the rubrics, which are these parts, as the word denotes, written in red that the priest does. So the altar missal is really for the priest. The hand missal, that's one term. Yeah, the
the daily Missal. This has both Latin and English, or for instance, we have a Latin-Spanish, Latin and a vernacular, and it does not include all of the things that the priests would do, but it does include, in addition to, we'll get through some of this later, not just the Mass, the prayers of the different seasons, but different devotional prayers, even different sacramental rites. So this book is, to be clear, primarily for Mass, but not just for Mass. It can be a great aid to preparing for Mass, for Thanksgiving after Mass, and for a variety of personal and family devotions.
Okay.
Yeah.
The paper is nice for this Missal too.
Yeah.
Sorry. Another shameless plug.
It is a shameless plug. We've tried really hard from the beginning. I think we've succeeded to make not just a complete Missal in the way of content, but a Missal that is beautiful and functional, and especially one that will last hopefully forever or almost forever, even if, over the decades it might need rebound. So, we have both leather and non-leather options. We use high quality paper, high quality binding. It's a book meant to last.
There's leather and pleather.
I don't know if it's technically pleather, to be honest, but maybe Joe can cut that part.
Come on, that was fun.
We'll see. Right. We'll see. It might make it. It might make it.
All right.
We'll see. And I actually, if you don't mind my pointing out, I think there is there's something to be said about the history of hand missals, because in its current form, it's true that these are relatively new, maybe 100 years. I think there's different formats, and certainly before the advent of the printing press, there wouldn't have been, missals as we know them. But some form of a hand missal is not uncommon, even in the 17th, 18th centuries. Some prayers either to help follow the canon or to help follow different liturgical seasons. Some people have done some very good research on this, because I think we want to imagine a certain kind of person wants to imagine that for centuries Catholics went to Mass and just had no idea what was going on. And I think that's something of a black legend. So I think even though in a way these the push for, let's say, a universal hand missal does in large part come out of the beginnings of the liturgical movement back when it was healthier, it's not like this is revolutionary, right?
Yeah.
So as you said, the point is this is an aid to entering into the mystery. It's not something, I think this is important, especially for beginners. It's not something you just read, right? It is something. You can do that. You can read it, especially if you're sitting there and you want to familiarize yourself with it. But the purpose of it is not to read. It's not to do something different than what's going on in front of you. It's to help you enter into the mystery before you.
Right.
So that's my pitch.
No, it's good. And just to be clear, this is not just one long ad for the Angelus Press Missal. We are hopefully going to be helping people to understand the Missal better, and by extension, to understand the Mass better and be able to participate in the Mass better, which is kind of the whole point.
It is the whole point, and a lot of what we'll be discussing, for instance, if you had an older Missal from your grandparents or something, the page numbers I reference aren't going to match up, and you're going to have to probably find slightly different variations on arrangements, but there's no reason that you can't use the broad outline of the order of the Mass to figure out with some help, how to follow an actual older Missal. So
right. So the concepts that we're talking about are going to be applicable to a St. Joseph's Daily Missal, a Confraternity, whatever, any one of those, as long as it's 1962. But even if it's not 1962, if it's a traditional Latin Mass Missal, 1955, et cetera, you're going to be able to
still
get
mostly
some information out of it. Yeah,
right.
Mostly.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at a few terms before we get started. Again, this is meant to be for someone who's relatively new, and you're going to be using words like the ordinary of the Mass, propers of the Mass, et cetera. So can we go through that real quick?
Yeah, let's do that. And you'll see that I have this Missal opened to, for us, page 838. This is the beginning of Mass. And the reason I think a lot of people get confused at first is because you can't just follow the Mass page by page, because there are parts of every Mass that are the same and there are parts that change. So those parts that stay the same we call the ordinary, and those parts that change, or practically the parts you will have to flip to another page in the book to find are called propers. And they are noted. You'll see as we move forward, it'll say, hey, this is, for instance, a proper. Go find it. We're going to explain how that's done. But that's one basic distinction I think that is worth knowing. I would stress at this point, too, that a lot of people, this is actually the source of confusion for a lot of people when they start using the Missal, that it's not actually perfectly straightforward, that you do have to familiarize yourself with, for instance, what feast day it is, ideally before you go to Mass, right? So it can be a feast day of a saint. It can be a liturgical season like Lent. Those are all going to have different, for instance, epistles and gospels. You're going to want to know where to look in the Missal. So yes, to summarize for now, the ordinary, those parts that stay the same, and the propers are the parts that change.
Okay. So when we talk about, hey, let's flip to the proper and let's find the introit for today's in the proper, that's what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then there's also going to be some other sections that we're going to be talking about, calendar, the saints, the commons, etc.
Yep. Yeah. So again, not to overwhelm people at first, I think it's worth looking at the table of contents when you first buy a Missal and familiarizing yourself with the broad outline. But for example, one division I would introduce at this point is that the liturgical year is broadly, I think we talked about this on some of the other podcast episodes. You have the temporal cycle and the sanctoral cycle. So if you're in if let's say you're in a liturgical season like Advent or Lent, you're going to find that section beginning around 137, and it goes chronologically. So you start with Advent. You're going to go through the Sundays of Advent. You're going to find yourself in Christmas, and then some of the special feasts after Christmas, all the way through, pre-Lent and Lent. So that's a good place to put one of these ribbons. It's also a great time to mention that the Missal comes with 5 ribbons. There's no intrinsic and special use that you have to use them in a certain way or a certain place. But as I say, maybe to begin, put one of these ribbons at 137. That's the beginning of the temporal cycle. I put another ribbon at 838. That's the beginning of the Mass. And then for the Feast of the Saints, when we're outside of those seasons, or for bigger things, that starts on page, as you can see, it's not actually listed because of the picture, but it's page 1041. So appropriately starts with November 30th, which is St. Andrew. And again, for many hundreds of pages, you're just going to chronologically follow that all the way through. You'll see we're in February and March. And so that whole section is also worth a ribbon, at least in the beginning. Those 2 sections, as far as propers go, will help you in almost all cases find what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And the way to find that in general, if your chapel has a bulletin, or they'll probably have the liturgical feasts somewhere in the bulletin. Our Angelos Press calendar, both the printed copy and the online copy, have that. Our free online Ordo has that. And sometimes, without getting into too many details, the priest will simply announce what Mass he's saying. So, again, if you can't find out what feast day it is, it's not the end of the world. You can still say the majority of the Mass, the central part of the Mass, the ordinary. You can unite yourself to the Mass that's going on without losing too much peace of soul. So
this is I'll just do a quick plug. This is one of the pages, 1962 ordo.today.
That's right.
I use this with doing podcast stuff and the daily devotionals. Super helpful.
Yeah.
This tells you, this is today when we're recording it, but it tells you what the Mass is, etc.
That's
super
right.
helpful.
That's
so
right.
We'll put a link for that as well.
Yep. And that's free. It's updated every day. It's a great resource.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So that's where we put the ribbons. That's kind of our kind of rough organization of it, and how we find out what we are going to be, what the Mass is going to be done for the day. How do we get started? You said you had a ribbon kind of right there in the middle of the Missal.
Right
with
there,
this.
page 838. It's the beginning of Mass. Maybe the one thing I'll mention again before we dive in and go through the Mass with the aid of the Missal, I think it's worth pointing out that there are different kinds of Mass, right? So you have a low Mass, which is a Mass without singing, or at least without sung parts from the priest, and that is That's the most common Mass, just because it's not the normative, but it's the most common form of traditional Latin Mass just because of the number of priests and the number of places they need to go. So it's also the simplest, so that's what we're going to use as a kind of model here. You will see prayers, for instance, in the ordinary that are for a high Mass. So if you go and there's lots of singing and you see incensation or things being chanted, those are in here too. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to walk through what a low Mass would be like. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
And then on the screen, and Joe, our producer, is probably going to put some other videos as well, but I do have a recording of a Mass from down in Phoenix at Our Lady of Sorrows. It is a high Mass, but a lot of obviously the movements of it's a sung Mass. A lot of the movements are going to be very, very similar. So we may be using that as sort of a visual aid as well. Yep. So let's dive in. Prayers at the foot of the altar.
Yeah.
The priest is at the foot of the altar.
That's right. The priest and the server or servers are there at the foot of the altar, and that's where Mass starts. That is where the Missal starts. So it's pretty straightforward. There are some prayers. There's a psalm that's prayed back and forth. There's the double confiteor, that's just the prayers for the confession. That lasts a few minutes, and that's a good place to enter into the spirit of the liturgy, the spirit of the Mass. It's relatively straightforward. You can follow this. It's going to be almost every Mass you go to that has this structure in the beginning. And the key is if you get lost, if the priest and the server are still at the foot of the altar, they have not yet got to the introit, the first proper. So that whole first part, from the very beginning of Mass to the introit, a number of prayers, but they're all said there. The last, you'll see, in fact, as he gets ready to say the introit, there's a couple prayers that he will pray as he ascends the altar, another one at the altar, and then he will go to the altar missal to pray the introit. The introit, as you can see in the Missal, has a note that says, "See the proper for the Mass of the day." Now, I don't know what Mass is on the screen, but let's pretend you were going to Mass. I think yesterday was the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity. So I should have bookmarked this, but I did not. So,
this one is third Sunday of Lent. I don't know if it matters or not, or if you care.
Oh, maybe let's do that because he's got the purple vestments on. So
up to you.
Third Sunday of Lent?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be great. Because it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this video. Right. So I'm going to start over by saying this is the third Sunday of Lent, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
So in the video, we're following a recording of the third Sunday in Lent. So as an example, if you had known before you had gone to Mass, it would be the third Sunday. On page 359, you'll find the third Sunday of Lent. You'll note that it mentions the color of the vestments. There's always in our Missal a little reflection on the day. And the introit, this is the first proper, usually a prayer from the Psalms. It's there on the screen. But this is where you would flip your page to find this. The priest would pray it. Then you'll see that there are going to be other propers coming up. Not quite yet. So you flip back. And that's going to be the rhythm, the main rhythm that you're going to have to get used to, which is bouncing around the Missal. Usually only 2 spots, sometimes 3, but they're all noted. So, for instance, you'll come back, there's the Kyrie, and then you have the Gloria, except in penitential seasons, and the Requiems a few other times. They're all noted. It's a good time to mention, maybe I'll do another section where I mention this again, but when you use our Missal, in the margins on the left, we have notes that are relevant to how to follow the Missal. They're practical notes. So as an example, here with the Gloria, it mentions the Gloria is omitted in Masses for the dead, Masses of a penitential nature, etc. On the right, in the margins on the right, you have something totally different. These are spiritual reflections. These are from a variety of sources. We have those sources listed in the beginning of the Missal. These are to help you, again, meditate before you go to Mass or help you enter into what's going on at Mass at that moment. So you'll see on every page in the left some practical notes, on the right some spiritual notes. You don't have to use either of them. You can ignore them, in fact, when you're first using the Missal, but they are helpful, and you'll find them throughout the Missal. So that's an aside. I should have mentioned it at the beginning. But
no, that makes sense. So if you're starting to kind of lose your place, the left is going to kind of help you figure out what's
practical
going on.
Notes,
and why didn't he say the Gloria today?
Or for instance, you'll see later when bells are going to be rung, you'll see a little picture of a bell in the left side. And that tells you, okay, if you've lost your spot, got it, there's a bell, I must be close to here. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So the Kyrie and the Gloria are back there in the
We're in the ordinary.
We're in
the ordinary. But then after the Gloria, if there's a Gloria, you're going to find in rapid succession a few different prayers that are going to be in the proper. So for instance, the collect, this is, again, you can see as an example, they tell you something about what the collect is in the marginalia, but then you would flip back to the propers for the third Sunday of Lent or whatever day you're in. And in succession, you're going to have the collect, the epistle, depending on the season, a gradual, a tract, sometimes a sequence, different prayers. You don't need to worry about what they all are. They'll all be there, or they'll be page numbers if you have to switch to another one there. You will flip, so you'll have a succession of those propers. That's probably the most in any one spot.
Is there a visual cue where we can see the difference if we're attending Mass and how do we know if the priest is saying the collect versus the epistle?
So, right. The collect, again, if you're at a low Mass, it's the first prayer after the Kyrie. There's always going to be a collect. The epistle, he'll put his hands on the, if you can see, he'll put his hands on the altar Missal. And then again, the gradual tract sequence, whatever prayers, depending on the season, come after, you're just going to know those are the last prayers he prays before he goes back to the center of the altar, where he'll say a few private prayers before he goes to the other side of the altar to announce the gospel.
Okay.
And that you'll follow that in the ordinary. It tells you, all right, there's a collect, there's an epistle. It includes the prayers before the gospel, but then the gospel, you will go back to the proper. You'll have the gospel there, and that's where, more or less, you might have a pause, because if there's going to be a sermon, the sermon is preached here. On the days the creed is going to be said in our Missal, it says the word creed or credo in the Latin part at the end of the gospel. Because the creed is not prayed every day, it's prayed on Sundays, major feast days of our Lord and such. That's a handy way to remember if the creed is going to be prayed. So you'll see it there. It's in the propers, but after the gospel, you will flip back. And as I say, the next page would be the creed. The creed, see, it says there on the left, the creed is only said on Sundays, feast days of the first class, feasts of the second class of our Lord, and so on. And then you're going to move to the Mass of the Faithful. That's another thing I should have mentioned at the beginning, but it's a handy time to point out. Right before the section in the Missal that includes, where Mass starts, we do have a very handy 2-page sort of division of the Mass. It's something that's good to, there it is, 836 and 837. It's very simple. If you find this overwhelming, this might be something to look at after a few times at the traditional Latin Mass, but it's also helpful for some people beforehand just to see the structure in 2 pages. So those are 2 handy pages. You can refer to them. It's, as I say, right before the section on the Mass, so you won't lose it. Okay, so now, either at the end of a sermon or the end of the gospel, we'll enter into the Mass of the Faithful. There is one more time here where you'll see there's a note, there's an antiphon at the offertory, C, the proper of the Mass for the day. You'll flip back. For instance, here would be the offertory. Again, usually a prayer from the Psalms. And then you're going to go back to the ordinary. Now, up until now, a lot of the prayers the priest was praying, not just the readings, the epistle and the gospel, but things like the introit and the Kyrie were said out loud. And if you were, most times, unless you were, let's say, in a big church far back, you're going to be able, up until the Mass of the Faithful, you're going to be able to follow along to a certain extent audibly. This is going to change here as, especially as we get into the canon, but even at this point, the priest is not praying in a voice that can be heard by the faithful. Maybe we discuss this different tones the priests use in a different podcast. But what you're going to need to do if you get lost is pay attention more to the movements of the priest. And because of that, I'm going to walk through a few times where you would notice in the pew the priest doing something, even if you can't hear what he's saying. That will help you find your place in the Mass, in the Missal. So to begin, after the offertory verse, he's going to offer the host, and then you'll see him in this second prayer. It says, for instance, again, practical note, the priest pours the wine and the water. So you'll see the priest go to the right side of the altar. You'll see the servers bring him water and wine. It's a great visual cue for you to see what's going on. You can follow. He returns in this next prayer to the center of the altar, offers the chalice, and then also these little red notes that you'll find are not rubrics in the same way as I mentioned earlier, meaning they're telling the priest what to do, but they are describing for you what the priest is doing. So, for instance, when it says, with his hands joined upon the altar and bowing slightly, you can usually see that, right? So you can usually, if you can't hear, you can tell where you are in the Mass. For instance, you'll certainly see him do the blessing here at the Veni Sanctificator. So this next section is a great example of how things can be different at a high Mass, the incensing of the offerings. If you're at a low Mass, you just skip this. If you're at a high Mass, you would follow along. I'm going to skip this for today because we're not following a high Mass. Okay. Then there's the lavabo, the washing of the hands. Again, you won't be able to hear him, but you'll be able to see him go to the side of the altar. You'll see the altar servers. You can follow along in your Missal. The priest returns to the center of the altar and prays the prayer to the Most Holy Trinity. And then he'll turn for the Orate Fratres, he'll actually kiss the altar and turn around. These are all cues you can follow. The prayers are very beautiful. And you'll go now into the last proper before communion, which is the secret. So again, if we were following the third Mass of Lent, you turn back to your other ribbon. There's the prayer for the secret. And you're coming to the preface. So the preface, it's not a proper, it's variable, but we don't include it here because there's only so many of them. So instead of including it in every Mass, what we do is simply note on that day what preface it's going to be. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. After the secret is prayed, there is some more prayers here, the exchange between the priest and the servers or the congregation if it's a high Mass. And then you'll see, it can be a little confusing. We have several pages of prefaces. But again, if you get confused, some of them are obvious, preface for Lent, preface for the Epiphany. It will always be noted there, whatever day you're following. So that should help you find the proper preface. And then after the preface, see, there's a few pages. There's the Sanctus. There's a great example of the bells. Bells are always rung at the Sanctus. You'll see both on the left side a little hint that that's what's going on. And again, some spiritual commentary on the symbolism and the structure of the Mass at that point. We're now in the canon. Again, the priest, you're not going to hear what he's saying. There aren't quite as many visual cues, but you can follow along, and you can read. You can certainly pray the prayers in union with the priest. You can read the commentary. You can unite yourself as best you can. I do like the preface, but not so often. You'll see that there's this third prayer, the Communicantes. Normally, it's listed here, but there are a few feasts in the year where, if it's Christmas or Easter, there will be a proper Communicantes. But again, if that's the case, it will be noted in that part of the Mass where the propers are. So if you don't see anything, it's just going to be what's in here, and you can skip this extra page for the special Communicantes. The prayers of the consecration, that's probably going to be easy to follow, and it's probably the one place where if you don't need a missal because you can see at least the elevations of the body and blood of our Lord, you can put down your missal, you can read some of the commentary, but that's fairly obvious. I think you won't need the missal for this part, unless you maybe don't know the prayers, you want to know what the priest is praying. That's great. Some of the commentary here is very helpful. You'll see where the bells are. You'll notice them. So the consecration section, that's just something maybe to read, familiarize yourself beforehand. But there we are. After the consecration, we have the prayers after the consecration. Again, these are not going to be prayers you hear, but you will be able to tell. For instance, there are some prayers where the priest bows or extends his hands, makes some signs of the cross. All of that is explained. Again, we're going to several pages of these prayers, and it's a very beautiful part of the Mass. One of the most ancient and unchanged parts. Goes all the way up through the minor elevation. I think the commentary here is, for instance, something that is largely unknown. This is something you're going to want to read, to meditate on, all the way to the Pater Noster. Now, the Pater Noster is the moment where the priest comes out of this kind of silence, and he again returns to a louder voice, a clear voice, as the Missal says. And so that's another moment where if you got lost in that section between the consecration and the minor elevation, or the bells of the minor elevation caught you off guard, you're at the Pater Noster. And so, again, very important part of the liturgy. There are some prayers after where, again, you can follow along. You may not see these parts. For instance, there's a fraction of the host and things like that, but you can follow along in your missal. It's one of the things it's there for. There's the commingling of the sacred body and blood. And then probably what is, again, familiar is this, or easier to see, the Agnus Dei and the prayers for Holy Communion. So the Agnus Dei, again, prayed or sung. This is a part where you'll be able to follow along and even pray some of these prayers oneself, because they lead right up to the communion. And of course, the communion of the priest, that's here. And something that is worth noting is once you get through following the communion of the priest, what is not in the Missal is in fact the prayers that precede the communion of the faithful, which might be a little surprising because, in fact, you will see in here, in the Missal, it does say communion of the faithful, and there are a few prayers that the priest will say right before he starts to distribute Holy Communion. But as a custom, and what was a part of the traditional Latin Mass, there's this section here that's not it's not technically in the Missal, but people get confused because it's not in the Missal, between the priest receiving the precious blood and the communion of the faithful, popularly is called the second Confiteor. Now, you might remember, or you might not, at the beginning of Mass, we said the Confiteor. And if you want to go back to that section towards the beginning of Mass, it's not the whole thing because the priest is not saying it, but this public confession that begins for the faithful on page 842, that's what the servers start to pray. So if you hear the servers start to pray something after the priest has received the chalice, that's what's going on. The priest will even pray these couple of prayers after the Confiteor, and then he will say these prayers that are listed under Communion of the Faithful. Is that clear? I think that's one of the more confusing parts for people who are attending.
And I think I've gotten some questions before, either live streaming a Mass or when we do articles on the Mass. Why is there no second Confiteor listed in the Missal? Are you guys heretics? Are you?
Yeah.
And the answer is no, but because the Mass itself, it doesn't necessarily, and tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know what the actual reasoning why it wasn't put in, but because the communion of the faithful is not a necessary part of the Mass, so it's not put in.
Right. It's not a necessary part of the Mass. So, for instance, if a priest were saying a private Mass,
there would be no second confiteor.
Well, I mean, there would be in the sense if there was a server
Right.
who was receiving Mass, but yeah, I think it was obligatory, and I think in the 1962 Missal it was taken out, but it retained its customary status. So I think people, including the Archbishop, just kept it in out of a custom. This is a great part that the Father can just cut if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. Yeah, I think that's the answer. I think it was technically taken out, but everyone practically kept doing it because otherwise, I think you would just go from the reception to the Ecce Agnus Dei, and I think that doesn't really. I don't know. Maybe there's more to it than that. That's my understanding.
Sure.
Now I'm back to regular mode here.
Okay. All right. So we have we saw the consecration, we saw the communion, we saw the second confiteor, and then there's this whole, usually a long section. If there's a lot of people attending Mass on a Sunday or something like that, there's a pretty long section of people receiving, which we're just going to skip through because, again, not
we're going to skip through the video,
really
but I'm going to use this occasion to mention, we're going to go through a few other sections in the actual book at the end, but this is a great opportunity to mention some of the other, as an example, some of the other things that are in this book, right? The Missal as a book. So if you're in a situation like you just described, you're in a big church, there's a lot of people, there's going to be some time before you receive Holy Communion. Like the Missal in general, there's no one thing to do. You could meditate, you can reread some people read the Gospel or the Communion, but we do have whole sections. So we have whole sections of prayers for communion, before and after. They start around page 82 here. These are a variety of traditional Catholic prayers. You find the ones that you love the most, that you are familiar with, or for instance, here we have the traditional prayer of St. Ambrose, the prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas, and then around page 89, we have prayers after communion. So this is a great occasion, depending on what church you're in, what your situations are. It's another example of how the Missal can be used beyond just following the Mass itself. So we call these helpful supplements.
So the section there in the 80s pages, great stuff for the quiet parts of the Mass before and after communion. And then you'll start to see, like we have on the video here, where Father is doing the kind of putting the altar back together after communion, purifying the sacred vessels.
Yeah.
That's called the ablutions. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, he's purifying the paten, the ciborium, the chalice. And there are some prayers, as you can see, that go along with this part. This is also, this is after communion for the faithful. So this is a part where, you're making your thanksgiving, talking to our Lord, praying whatever prayers you want. But there are these prayers that go on at that moment. And they lead directly into, as you say, sort of the altar's put together, the sacred vessels are cleaned. You're going to make your last, depending on how you do it, 1 or 2 flips. So the 2 prayers right after the ablutions are the communion and the post-communion. So in this example, we'd go back, you would see the communion, and you would see the post-communion. Those are the 2 prayers he says, close the Missal when he's done, and that's kind of the signal for him that he's done with the actual altar Missal. And for you, it's the signal that you are done flipping around your book. So that's one way to look at it. I will note here, you'll see, for instance, sometimes what the prayers and antiphons would be for Vespers. You can ignore that at this part of your journey to the traditional liturgy. But those will be useful in other cases. So the communion and the post-communion, the last 2 propers, and now you're at the conclusion of the Mass. So there will be the dismissal, there will be a prayer to the Holy Trinity, the blessing, and the last Gospel. And that will take you to the end of Mass. Now, if it is a low Mass, there is a section. It's not technically part of Mass. It is, but it is customary. You'll see it. You'll see it done everywhere after Mass. These prayers ordered by the Pope. So it's you can't miss it because it's the page right after the last Gospel. So Mass is ended, but these prayers after low Mass, they were originally they were originally instituted by Leo XIII to resolve the seizure of the Papal States, and then later, I think as it says, Pius XI in the 1920s changed the intention to the conversion of Russia. So these prayers are customary. They're here. You can follow along. Sometimes the priest will pray them in the vernacular, sometimes in Latin. Either way, you've got them. And if you're in England, you have the prayer for the Sovereign of England. So we do have, because it's not just an American missal, you'll see some things, Canadian, English, feast days throughout the missal. But that is your basic guide to following a low mass with our missal. And if I would stress one thing, it's to not be anxious, not to be overwhelmed or upset if you get lost, if you get confused. As I said, the mass the purpose of the missal is not to read the mass. It's not to, follow along slavishly. This is only helpful to the extent that it helps you unite your intention with the priest and with the mass. So even once you get used to the missal, even once you have, let's say, familiarized yourself with the whole book, you might use it in a slightly different fashion from day to day or week to week.
Sure.
So, no need for scrupulosity here.
Right. You don't have to exactly follow what Father is doing at the altar. So if he's saying the secret and you're not, and you miss that part, you can read it later. You can read it during the canon. You can. Again, it's not about, well, I didn't get as many graces. And again, I'm speaking not so much to you because I know you know this, hopefully. But it's more about, again, trying to be as active a participant, like we talked about with Father Palco last week,
in the true
as
sense.
active a participant as you can be.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily even need the missal. Like Father Palco said, you don't need the missal to be an active participant, but it really does help. So I had a little bit of technical difficulty. There's probably going to be a quick skip on the video. Sorry about that. The other stuff that's in the missal, and we're not going to get to all the things that are in the missal. Again, it's pretty comprehensive, as we talked about. But if you're attending a mass and you might notice, I'm sharing this video here of, again, the same mass that we've been looking at. You might see something similar to this on the bottom right corner in the front of the church, where it says pro and it says KYR and it says credo with some Roman numerals. Procession, that's the first thing. So that's the hymn that everyone's saying when Father processes in. But Jim, what is the KYR and credo, and where can we find that in the missal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we went through the mass, I noted a few parts like the incensation of the altar. I mentioned there would be some singing of certain parts like the credo and the Gloria. But it's true that those notes or those abbreviations you can see often on boards refer to what is called the Kyriale, which is technically the sung parts. It's a notated, an annotated version, and you can find those in the back of our missal. So if you go to page 1865, you will see all this chant. Which, again, if you've never sung before, if it's overwhelming, you don't have to sing it at first, but you can at least follow along, and you'll see, for instance, depending on the number, there are different melodies, different collections of these. So, Kyrie 4 for ordinary feasts, Kyrie 8, De Angelis for ordinary feasts. And so there's a number of different Kyries, and then there's a number of different credos at the back, so 4 of them. And you can find those, again, the very back of our missal. They're very helpful, especially if you like to sing or you'd like to learn to sing. Those are great. And they'll at least, again, help you follow along with a high mass. So
okay. And then we have we talked about how there's the Gloria sometimes and the Credo sometimes.
Yeah.
We talked about how there's the Insensation and not other times. Again, if you're not super familiar with how to follow along, go with a friend who maybe has done it before. Maybe they can kind of show you as you go, or you can watch a live stream YouTube video of St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary or St. Mary's or, any of our chapels and just kind of try to follow along as well. That's a good way of doing it too. Those are just ways that I've kind of helped my own kids try to figure out how to do it and people that I've brought into the church as well.
Yeah.
other things that are in the Missal. We talked about the before and after prayers. What about, there's a lot of other devotions and things like that.
Yeah.
Why did you guys why did Angelus Press decide to put those in, and when are they used?
Well, as to why we decided, part of it is a certain tradition in hand missals to have a collection of devotions. It also made sense that if this is a book you're primarily going to be bringing to the church, we tried to anticipate other times when you might be needing a book at church. So again, most of it kind of predates us. We didn't exactly we didn't come up with the idea as such, but there are things that are unique to our missal. Or things, for instance, the Stations of the Cross is it's a unique, it's a special version from some of the priests that wrote it. But as an example of other things, in fact, I would say if you look at the first 100 pages, you can go to the table of contents when you first get the Missal, you'll see just how many things there are that are going to be useful to you, just throughout life. So there's little catechetical sections, there's basic prayers, morning and evening prayers, litany of the saints. Some of the things I would point out, though, is devotions for confession on page 65. This can be very helpful, not just because it has a brief examination of conscience. It has some prayers for before confession, a little, as I mentioned, the examination. After the examination, it tells you if it's been a while, if you're helping your children learn, it tells you how to make a confession. And again, some prayers after confession. That's a great example of something that's useful in here. I mentioned the stations, but I think maybe the things that are going to be most useful are some of the other sacramental rites. So if you're attending a baptism, you can go all the way in the back to page 829. You can see there's a whole section for the sacraments, and then you'll see there's both a catechetical section on baptism and the ceremonies. So you could follow along if you had the good fortune to attend a traditional rite baptism. There is also confirmation in a few pages starting at 842. Again, same format. We have some basic catechetical information and then the rite of confirmation. There are also some very, even though they're not all, let's say, sacramental rites. For instance, if you go to the section on extreme unction, you will have that. But then there's also included just some prayers in preparation for the dying. These can be very helpful. For example, it tells you how to prepare a room if a priest is bringing Holy Viaticum. There are some prayers, yes, for those in their last agony. There are even some prayers for after someone has died. So again, in these circumstances, it's often these prayers exist in many places, but sometimes it's hard to remember where those books are. So those things are in the Missal as well. And I guess I would mention one thing. You may find yourself attending, for lack of a better term, unique masses, a requiem mass, a wedding mass. Those are all in here as well. So again, around page, you can look them up in the table of contents. But we do have first the nuptial mass at 1597 with some information, and then again at 1609 we have the masses for the dead. So those are all useful. Those are probably the most common, let's say, special masses that you might attend. The point is not to overwhelm you. The point is to let you know that these are all examples of things that are included in the Missal. And I'm really just scratching the surface. So I hope, again, it shows you that even when you're not at Mass, this is a great book in preparation for going to Mass. It's a great book to learn about the faith, learn about the liturgy. There's great things. There's morning and evening prayers, even for families. So, it's meant to be a resource in every way.
Yeah. And I am, you are not a priest. I'm not a priest. And so I always hesitate for a couple laymen to give spiritual advice. However, I am just echoing what several of our other priests have said in several other episodes, and that is prepare as much as you can ahead of time, especially if you are new to using a Missal. And again, this is friendly advice, not spiritual advice. If you're new to using a Missal and you're not 100% sure, and you're going to go to Mass on a Saturday and you're going to bring the Missal, I would highly recommend that you don't just show up and start to try and figure out where you are. The evening before or earlier that morning while you're having your coffee, try and figure out where the places are. Go to the 1962 Ordo.today and, all right, are they going to say a Gloria or not? Do a few minutes of groundwork ahead of time is going to help you to really be in a participation mode at the Mass instead of fumbling around and feeling panicky.
Right.
And you shouldn't feel panicky anyway.
No, but it's a very good point to prepare. I know there, some people or some customs of even reading the gospel, the epistle and the gospel the night before, especially on preparation for Sundays or big feast days. It's true. Yeah. Prepare before Mass. But again, I think the main thing is to take the time to get to know the book, take the time to, as you said, follow along to the best of your abilities, but not to get caught up in trying to, make sure you're at the right part of every second.
Sure.
So, and I would point out as well that we, again, could seem like shameless plugging again, but we have a variety of different missals too. So we have simpler missals for young adults, even simpler missals for children. This is not, for instance, something you want to give a 7-year-old. There's just too much.
Yeah.
Prudence will dictate, when someone's ready for it. But we do have a variety of different missals, and we do have a variety of books. If you want to go deeper into the history or the spirituality, the symbolism even of the Mass, this podcast series is part of what we're trying to accomplish in that area. But a lot of it's based on the books we carry, and so you'll see, as I mentioned, this kind of commentary that runs in the right margin. Comes from a variety of places, but one of the places is Your Mass in Your Life. So I'm gonna move that book right there. A lot of that comes from this book. It's a collection actually of 5 books, but that's one example. Something else that may even be better for the beginner. So if this is too much for you, if this is something that you just find overwhelming, this Visitor's Guide to Mass, which is really more of a booklet, this is the most basic version. It's not meant to be followed, so it's not a missal in that sense, but it is an explanation of why is it in Latin. They'll follow through a bit, not prayer by prayer. But you might want to look at something like that first if it's just too overwhelming. The only point I want to make is that we do have a variety of resources, the videos, the books, all of which is meant to help you live the Mass more deeply. That's really the goal.
Yeah. And the thing is also with the Missal, you mentioned it at the beginning, but just to reiterate, it's not something that I don't want to say it's like a reference book because it's more than a reference book, but in the same way that you kind of move around in various places, like in an encyclopedia. Well, no one uses that anymore, but the Missal is similar to that. It's meant to be used as you need to use it and as you want to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It is. It's a great book to have, even if you can only make it to Mass occasionally, because you can still, for instance, follow the readings of the day. Plenty of material for help with spiritual communions and the like. So, something for everyone.
Absolutely. Jim, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for putting this together and going through all of this stuff with us. I'm sure it'll be helpful, and we'll keep going.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.